Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I am your host this afternoon. My name is Jake, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by three fantastic guests who are going to talk us through planning for preparedness post-COVID-19. We have Chris from Hotwire. Good afternoon, Chris.
Afternoon.
Annabel from Question and Retain.
Hi, great to be here, thanks.
Thanks, Annabel. And Kate from Field and Communications.
Hello, good afternoon.
We have a lot to get through, and we have a lot of people on the line, so thank you all so much for joining us. And do feel free to join in the conversation as we go through today's webinar. You can ask a question at any moment using the question box in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Our hosts and guests today are very prepared to answer anything you can throw at them to help for planning after the storm. You can also tweet us at video, use the hashtag after the storm, or find us on any of the channels you would expect. Just going to start here. This is the new normal insofar as the current situation many of us are facing. Times are hard. I won't read out all the stats on the screen, but I will ask Annabel if you could just explain the mental health score for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Q&R faced COVID, we decided to pivot, using the P word, our business to really focus on how companies, and particularly agencies, were coping and how their employees were coping, mental health and well-being. So we provided pulse checks out for around about 2,500 employees now, either working or furloughed. And we have created a mental health score and found that the aggregate across those 2,500 employees is around 71%, 7.1 out of 10. And so we're using that as a benchmark to then compare ongoing pulse checks we do. And then for the furloughed employees, we found that that's slightly lowered, around 5.7 or 57%. So a clear trend immediately that those that are furloughed are clearly suffering more stress, financial security and job uncertainty as we go towards post-lockdown. So that's how the mental health score is formed. It's through a pulse check, an email-based survey that goes out to all employees.
Thank you. So I think it's important to note, obviously, today we're talking quite a lot about different strategies and brand strategies and business strategies as we approach what we hope is the end of the lockdown measures. But also, and I think all of our speakers touch on this to some extent, is the people that we work with, for, and our colleagues and suppliers and everyone else is going through a very similar situation at the moment. This is not unique to us. And we must remember things like mental health and well-being are hugely important at this time and must play an important part as we get back to some sense of normal. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first presenter, Chris Paxton. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Jake. Yeah, so I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes just to whiz you through 7 tips for what we're calling the planning post-COVID. And I'll talk through these relatively quickly. If you've got your questions, we can go through those at the end. But I think the first place to start from our perspective is about keeping one eye on your original destination. So I've called that always keeping the North Star in sight. And I think in times of kind of uncertainty, it's fundamental that we all stay anchored to the company's core DNA, be that company DNA or brand DNA. So knowing why your company exists, how it delivers value to customers, what the ambitious goals are in the long term, and what those beliefs and behaviors are, ensure that whatever the current situation, it's merely a detour rather than plotting a new route. And I think making sure that we have these in sight and that we call them back up, make sure that any short-term actions that we're having to use now and any plans that we're putting in place now continue to strengthen your company's perceptions, the reputation, and build value in the long term. So that's about kind of being core or staying true to your purpose, your vision, and your mission. The second one is much more about strategy, and when we think about strategy, in my view, that's essentially about problem solving. So you can't solve the problem until you've articulated it first. So when we think about the pressures of the current situation, that's going to create new and different problems for companies to solve. So we know that actually some companies are wrestling with a huge uptick in demand currently, or perhaps your customers have disappeared overnight, whatever it is, what we need to think about is the problem that we have to solve going forward is likely to be a different one to the one we were solving for prior to this. So before you start any post-COVID planning, first we've got to revisit those problem statements and actually ensure that we're very crystal clear and single-minded about the problem that we're trying to solve. The third one is more about audiences. So we know that people don't buy the features of your products and services, they buy their benefits. And why? Because they address their needs and their wants. So what we may find, and I think it's likely that we find, is that because of the virus, your audience may have changed entirely and or their needs may have changed too. So if you think of a very kind of topical brand at the moment, if you consider Zoom for a moment, previously their audiences was more business professionals and they solved the problem of having to travel to meetings. When we think about their audience now, seemingly it's everybody. And they're now solving the problem of actually connecting face-to-face at all. So when it comes to thinking about campaigns in the future, we need to think carefully about who your audience is now, what their needs are now, and then revisit the functional and emotional benefits that your brands and your products deliver to ensure that we're meeting and solving for the needs of the new audience and the new kind of demands. Number 4 is about thinking about good strategy, and good strategy is ultimately about making smart choices. And then once we've made those smart choices, it's about staying single-minded with everything after that point. And I think currently we're all feeling the pinch in our businesses. We know that financial resources are tight and that there are many demands, many people, many departments, many teams all fighting for those scarce resources. So when we think about building our communications plans and campaigns in the post-COVID world, even more so than ever before, I think it's fundamental that we continue to make tough choices, that we stay focused, and most importantly, that we're single-minded about whatever we do. I think the urge will be after this period to jump to a list of activities that we'd like to do. We'll want to do everything, but I think we must resist that urge to jump to tactics and stay as single-minded as we possibly can. Good ideas. I mean, good strategy is always the bridesmaid for good creative. People love good ideas, not necessarily just data and logic. And when we project forward to the market conditions post this crisis, we need to think about the sheer number of products, campaigns, messages that will all be vying for our attention back in the world. I think it's going to be almost impossible to outshout those other companies. So instead, we're going to need to rely on our creative partners to develop really big, really bold, and really distinctive ideas. So, and as clients, if you're clients of an agency, we need to think about, you need to be braver than you've probably ever been before. You know, now is the time to think big. We have to think big in order to cut through. So, you know, those good ideas will definitely never go out of fashion. New normal, that seems to be what everybody's talking about now. I think, you know, after this period, the logic and the wisdom used to be that if you changed attitudes first, then behaviors would follow. And more recently, the accepted wisdom is that actually behaviors change and then our attitudes change afterwards. We post-rationalize that. So we know that behaviors are changing, have changed during this period. And as we think about planning our channels, our content as we go forward after this period, we need to make sure that we reflect the increased and probably sustained growing importance of digital, and be sort of cognizant and reflective of the newfound limitations of the physical world. You know, never has that been truer for many different businesses, but we need to make sure that content and channel planning reflects this kind of upsurge in the importance of digital. So those are kind of 6 real tips, and then the 7th one, just to leave you with, is thinking about, so if we were able to deliver to all of those 6, would we be successful? And I think there's just one other thought to leave you with, which is actually it's never too early to start planning for the post-COVID period. So I think the first thought is go early, start soon, and start to think, especially given what we need to think about in terms of audiences, be very specific in terms of thinking about who that audience is, what problem we're solving for, what choices we're making. And then lastly, think big. The big ideas are going to be the ones that cut through. And actually now, if not more than ever, is the time that we should think and act differently to the way we have before this particular period. So that's me. I'm happy to answer any questions about that later, but for now, I'll hand over to the next part.
Brilliant, Chris. Thank you so much. Annabel, let's go straight into your section.
I'll leap in. Yes, I took the storm analogy to its full conclusion with some pictures that look like there has been a storm, and we are indeed in a mess. There is a lot of debris to start clearing. So if you take that analogy, what I would always start with is, how are your people feeling? How are your teams doing in this time? And start to really understand that, because your people are your biggest asset. They are going to be the ones that their loyalty and dedication and motivation in adapting to new world are going to help you succeed in whatever strategy you take forward. And in that, really look for the green shoots. It's been the likelihood is it's a fundamental change in the way that we're going to be working. There's already talked of a new standard for spaces between desks, staggered working hours, sanitizers, 2 people in a lift at a time. So massive behavioural changes that people are going to go through. So really understand of your people where the resilience is, where there are pockets of fear and anxiety, and try and work as far as possible to ensure that you keep your lifeboat crew happy through these changes they're going to have to get used to. And also, discard the old practices. Look at what hasn't worked for you. There's been a big move to try and get flexible working and working from home on the agenda for lots of people. And suddenly we've seen, by having to do it, perhaps more dyed-in-the-wool leadership teams have had to suddenly adapt and actually have realised that their teams can actually be just as happy and productive and even more efficient if they've got the opportunity to be grown-ups and work from home. So, as Chris would say, definitely check your pre-COVID business plan. Where was it? What's it need to look like going forward? And also to future-proof. This isn't a one-off pandemic. We are going to have repeats of this over the months and years to come until a vaccine's in place. So future-proofing your business whilst looking at what's worked well and what hasn't as you've handled this one will be helpful. And I put the word agility in there. Absolutely. Those that can respond to change quickly will be the ones that rise above and succeed going forward. So rebuilding in the new world. Also look inwards, look at you as a leadership team or your leadership team, how they've responded, what you've done well and what you haven't, and what lessons you can learn so that your crisis planning is in better shape going forward. Making sure that your staff are upskilled digitally. We've seen some successes and failures in there so far, but those that can adapt quickly again. And adopting the fourth revolution, so the convergence of digital technologies, bio, nano, and information of things. Those that are ahead with autonomous AI and automation will be able to help mitigate against future crises. So really make sure that as part of your future planning that crisis management is front and central. And then again, reflecting, I keep coming back to this, on how you operated and build that into your brand story. It's really important that you come together, those that are currently working and those that are furloughed. You need to join those two sides of the business if you have furloughed any people to make sure that you've got a cohesive story of how you all coped with it, because there'll be a potential divide there that you need to build bridges between. And then it will be important for your brand story that internal messaging and understanding of what you all went through is then played back out to your audiences. So the 3 takeaways I would suggest are to gather insight, really understand what your teams are thinking and feeling, and continue to take regular pulse checks along time, either handling that internally or working with external consultants to really get a handle on that. And communicate clearly. There will be a lot of nervousness, as I mentioned, with furlough staff particularly, will be concerned about job security. Make sure that you're communicating the stages of the planning as you go along, and admit your vulnerabilities. There might be times when you really do not know what you're doing, but make sure that you bring your team with you on that. And then continue to review your plan, test it and refine it based on changing circumstances of the new world of work as we all enter that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Annabel. So yeah, we will get to questions at the end. So anyone has a question, we will have a Q&A. But we are now going to move straight on to Kate for Kate's presentation.
Thanks, Jake. Well, I've gone with a slightly different analogy to Annabelle's. I've thought about this as a journey and possibly that sort of displacement activity for all the journeys that we're not taking at the moment. So I think it's useful to just sort of start by acknowledging that strategic planning is really, really hard at the moment. We are much more inclined to kind of want to look ahead and plan when we're feeling upbeat and optimistic. And doing it in the middle of a crisis and when we've got so many kind of worries and anxieties going on is tough. But it's really well worth doing, and there's lots of good evidence to show that the organisations that can do that and who invest time in that will come out as the leaders and the innovators in the next stage. So just very briefly, I think, 3 stages that we're going through. At the moment, I've heard lots of people talking about this as kind of organisations operating in low power mode at the moment. And I think, that's about sort of people cutting their costs, kind of focusing in, putting the sort of minimum resources in place that they need to kind of keep going and deal with the immediate crisis and challenge. But we are starting, I think, now to kind of be moving into this kind of new normal phase that other people have talked about. And obviously, as we've said, the indications are all there that we are not going to be kind of getting a clear end to the lockdown for some time. We're going to continue with a lot of the adaptations that we're working with at the moment. And we could see sort of global kind of waves of infections emerging, things opening up and then kind of closing down again. I think that the challenge there is I've been talking to various kind of comms and marketing teams who are saying that they are being asked to sort of develop scenarios for hundreds of different possible outcomes and getting kind of stuck into this analysis paralysis. And I think that's to be avoided, and I'll talk in a second about how I think maybe you can sort of challenge that a little bit. I think just the last thing to say is that, in the long term, we are looking at something different. A lot of you will know that the sort of the idea in psychology that it takes 30 days to form a habit, and we're now 6 weeks into a completely different way of living. So there are things that are being laid down now that are going to last. And in actual fact, the RSA and YouGov did a poll a little while ago that showed only 9% of people wanting things to go back to how they were. So, lots of people are seeing positives coming out of this and changes to the way that they're living, they're relating to their families and communities. Obviously, lots of negatives as well, people suffering loss, and some people are having a bit of both. All of that is going to kind of change us. And the critical thing is, as an organisation, is not to sort of wait for the change to come and figure out then whether you're relevant. You need to kind of get ahead of that. So yeah, thinking kind of continuing with the journey analogy, I think, let's kind of put together a packing list. There's 4 things that when I was reflecting on this, I think that we're going to need on the journey. Chris and Annabel have talked a little bit about some of them. Firstly, your purpose, as Chris said, your North Star, making sure that you've got that kind of really clear understanding of your why. Aristotle talked about kind of finding the place where the world's needs and your talents cross, and that's the thing that you are looking for in terms of purpose. If you need to spend time on developing or redeveloping that, that's really important to do at the moment. Secondly, a philosophy. As comms people, I think we understand that reputation is shaped by values. And your philosophy, your ethos, your values are the guiding principles for behaviour, and that's why we place so much emphasis on our leaders' values. So you need to be able to kind of reference a set of shared values or beliefs that are going to kind of give you that guide as to what's important to you and what you're going to prioritise. And actually, we've seen through this crisis in terms of the arguments about kind of going into lockdown or coming out of lockdown, there are kind of philosophical beliefs that are sitting behind different positions there around prioritising individual freedom or taking a safety-first approach. So those things can kind of lead to some really big decisions. The third thing that I think we're going to need on this journey is narrative. You need a story, and that's because stories are the most effective means of spreading ideas. And you need everybody engaged in your strategy and the changes that you are making. And stories help us to imagine a future by describing where we've been, where we are now, and where we're going, and doing that in a memorable way. And then the final thing that I think that we need is insight. And Chris has talked about, the kind of the specificity of audiences, and I think it's been really interesting reflecting on that notion that we're all in this together, which actually I think in many ways has turned out not to be true. We're all having a very different experience now, and we will all be having very different experiences on the other side of this, and so getting really specific about your audience so that you can be relevant to your specific tribe is a really important thing to think about. So then finally a few thoughts about how we're going to kind of travel on this journey. So I think the first thing is kind of start with the big picture, roll up your sleeves, get stuck into those whole organisation strategy discussions. Comms can bring insight and external perspectives to the table that are incredibly valuable for that. But obviously, when you come to think about the kind of the actual comms strategy, make sure that you are translating that into your comms impact. So, how specifically is our communications going to help us to achieve those big objectives? Definitely, work quickly and crowdsource. You need to kind of answer lots of big questions about external context, internal context, strategic options, and it's not realistic or efficient to do that alone. So gather preferably lots of diverse people together, get their honest input. Don't get bogged down in trying to be comprehensive. Just get down stuff that's top of mind, come back to it once or twice, and then move on. And in terms of avoiding that kind of analysis paralysis, personally, I feel like 4 scenarios is always enough. So do yourself a kind of a 4-square grid, 2 axes with your critical factors along each axis. So that might be kind of shorter along the lockdown, more or less reluctance to travel along those 2. That's going to give you 4 scenarios, which is more than enough to start thinking about what are the levers that you can pull, what are the alternative kind of approaches that you'll take to those varying scenarios. Thirdly, like comms strategies, like any strategies, it's top line. You're answering the questions what, why, and who. It's key choices and decisions and what's driving those, and your top line messaging. So really, that's a couple of pages or a 5 to 10 minute presentation. Leave out the detail, just the bones of the argument, and make it memorable. Next, I think leave some room for inspiration. It's important to kind of have a strategy that's realistic, that you can measure, but it's equally important to have something that gets people excited and enthused. So, reach out for some BHAGs, your big, hairy, audacious goals, just so that you've got something that can actually kind of generate some energy in there. And then finally, I've said go for walks and read books, which is partly just a way of justifying how I like to spend my time, but also well-being is really, really important, and these are kind of good ways to protect that. But also, these are really useful for 2 essential aspects of strategy. So one is honing your narrative instincts. You can't write great stories unless you read fiction and you kind of engage your empathetic muscles. And the other is kind of unlocking the power of your subconscious You'll know, many of you, about kind of system 1 and system 2 thinking. System 2 is your kind of rational, logical mind, and system 1 is the subconscious, which is massively more powerful. And it's when you kind of step away from focusing and concentrating on the problem at hand that you're able to kind of release that subconscious power of thinking. And actually, my last role was at the Natural History Museum, and when I was there, I was really excited because I found out about Darwin's daily routine. And obviously, Darwin was someone who kind of came up with some really great ideas. But actually, he only worked about 3 hours a day in a couple of 1.5-hour blocks. And the rest of the time was spent kind of going on some quite nice long walks and reading books with his wife. So, bear that in mind, and especially those people who are struggling during this period to kind of get much focus time at all, just remember, it's not necessary. It's the bits outside of that sometimes that are more important. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kate. Not least for advocating 3-hour workdays, but also for introducing us to the term BHAGs, which is incredible. Chris, I'm gonna kick us off with a question from one of the points you made about not being too tempted to rush to tactics. At what point do you think, after, assuming that at some point we come off lockdown and everyone's going back into their workplaces or a sense of normal workplace, at what point into the process would we get to a point where we are ramping back up the amount of work and tactics and activities that we're doing?
Yeah, I think in some instances the activities have become reduced. In other cases, I think they've been pivoted so that different things are happening. I think what we need to be doing is we need to be ready so that when they're no longer under restriction, that we're ready with our messages, with our campaigns. So that means we have to start now, because if we wait till then we're going to have a delay, and we've talked a lot about behaviours changing, new habits forming. Those that we want to maintain, we need to make sure we communicate the utility in a post-restricted world, and those that we want to do our very best to recapture, we need to be ready as soon as possible. So I think the answer to that question is that wait till that's over, start now and be ready to launch when that happens.
So have the plan all ready to go so you can just enact it as and when it's suitable to do so.
Absolutely.
And Kate, you said about this idea of the new paradigm, the new normal. Do you think we are going to be living in a new normal forever, or do you think old habits die hard and eventually due to the mechanisms of society, we are actually going to go back towards what life was like before the outbreak?
It's almost an impossible question to answer.
Sorry.
And the thing that we're dealing with at the moment is uncertainty. And I heard a nice video message this morning from Kwame Kwei-Armah, who's the artistic director at the Young Vic, who was quoting Hamlet, and he said, "We know who we are, but not who we may be." And that really is the challenge at the moment. Personally, I think we are shifting things. I think that it would be impossible to imagine for me that to kind of go through this and the challenges that we're experiencing as communities and societies and not be changed in some fundamental ways. But there's now the strangest folk, as they say. So I'm not going to make any really firm predictions about what that looks like.
No, I think that's fair enough. Sorry, I wasn't trying to catch you out, but you didn't fall into my trap there. And I think it's this idea that as we come off the new normal, and it ties back into what we were talking about right at the beginning with the mental health score, Annabel. So this idea of communication at all times. So we're communicating to everyone what we're doing, and you've all touched on this idea that we need to keep the business informed and get everyone on side. But what are the best methods to do that now, and as we go into the easing of lockdown restrictions, Annabel, if you could answer to that.
Yeah, what we saw at the beginning of lockdown was a real frenzy from leadership teams to make sure that everybody was uber connected. So there was a rush of Zoom meetings, one-to-one team meetings, virtual pubs, you name it. And I think the sheen has come off that a little, and now it's really to listen to what people actually need. And so sometimes an all-team meet up at 1 p.m. is not going to work. So continue to evolve the way that you're communicating and making sure that you're catching all. So some people might be missing their one-to-one water cooler moment. So trying to build that in so that the communication is tailored to the need. And I think that the key words to take away are to really instill confidence in your team, to empathise with them, and to be collaborative. So instill confidence, empathise, and be collaborative in coming up with best solutions to keep a positive culture going forward.
And do you think that would affect things like childcare and work-life balance and everything else that people are managing around their jobs? Do you think that will now change as we go into this?
Yes, and I also think a really interesting one, there's been a bit of a divide between those that feel, those that have got children at home and are being home educated versus those that do not have children. Those that don't, there can be a sense that those that have got children are having it, are not having to be so present and aren't on it as much as they are, perhaps doing 8-10 hours straight through at a screen, whereas you can't do that with children at home. But actually, those that are doing 8-10 hours through on a screen have challenges as well. So it's from a leadership perspective, it's understanding that you can't, every individual has their own response to this, and their anxieties might vary. You can't paint it all with one brush. I've just seen a question come in. Do you mind if I answer one, because I'm burning to answer it? The areas of business that might have green shoots from Phoebe J.
Yeah,
Boyd.
please do.
I just thought I'd come up. So I've been really interested in this, about where are the opportunities, particularly for PR agencies, which businesses are going to be all right after this, but which businesses need help. And I think there are 3 key areas, and again, that's having worked with a large number of agencies, so different client bases we've been seeing. And I think there's 3 key areas that are going to need a lot of support and PR advice and marketing will be those that are really struggling. So those that have a crowd gathering business, I suppose, theatres, gyms, cinemas and festivals, and trying to tailor your services that obviously meet with their declining budget, but also help them to be really innovative about how they adapt, because humans still need to gather in groups. So how is that going to be handled? The other area is manufacturing, construction and food service, anything where you've got service and shift workers. So how can PR and marketing campaigns be constructed to help communicate what's needed in those sectors? And the last one is healthcare and medical support. The healthcare sector is going to be overwhelmed, like it or not, because all those that have been staying away from hospitals, the worried well in some cases, will be flooding back once COVID has passed its the super peak. So healthcare and how to manage new world. So those 3 areas, I think it's really interesting to see how PR marketing could support them.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, we've had some questions come in. Chris, as Hotwire works with so many large consumer brands, I'm just wondering, we've had a question in here, with so much uncertainty, will consumers simply spend less? Is this something you're considering in the work that you're doing with clients?
Yeah, I think this. I'm not sure that they're going to spend less. I think that they're going to spend differently. I think it's like anything. I was having a conversation with somebody about this morning, actually. I think when you suppress anything for long enough, there will be a rebound to that. So I think there are certain sectors and industries that will see a short-term boom. I'm sure people want to go back to the pubs and the restaurants. All the things that we've been unable to do, people will be, they'll be clambering to do again. But I think what we're likely to see is a short-term boom in certain items, and then that will stabilize again. And then I think it will largely be dependent upon people's situations. They may be more thrifty, continue to be more thrifty in what they spend their money on, given their own personal situations.
And this is something that like people now can build into plans, like using the intelligence and insight they've got to work out where those areas are likely to be. Because like you say, we do expect people to go back to pubs and restaurants with some aplomb, I guess, when the lockdown is eased. So those kind of areas can start planning now for an earlier boost.
Yeah, absolutely. And those bigger ticket items, that are more involved, longer term, then I think for them it's more about re-establishing consideration of those brands, those categories, and making sure that people are ready, those businesses are ready when people are ready again.
Fantastic, thank you.
I think if I can just chip in a bit there as well, Jake. I think what I'd say is, there's lots of polls that are being done at the moment that are looking at sort of people's attitudes to spending, people's attitudes to kind of returning to pubs and restaurants and attractions. But, those are kind of really needing to be done on at least a kind of and redone on a fortnightly basis, because people's attitudes are shifting so fast. And I think there's, that's where that kind of danger is in looking too closely at the wheels that are spinning under your feet at the moment. And I think that the sort of the long-term view is around kind of looking to innovate and kind of anticipate people's needs and kind of think about those, the audiences who are kind of willing to go with you on that journey, rather than sort of trying to worry about like picking up everybody and kind of covering yourself for things that are changing really fast now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like you say, it's just constantly changing. So the need to always be in touch with what the current normal is, and compared to what it's going to be, I guess is super important to any plan. We are running over, but I will ask one last question to each of you in turn. I think, which is, obviously we're talking about planning. We're planning ahead. How far ahead should your plan go? Chris, if we'll start with you, like how far is your plan at this stage for post-crisis? How far are you looking ahead? Are we looking 6 months, 12 months?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's as a business, we're looking at our financial year. It's slightly weird. It's an Australian financial year, starts July the 1st. But from our own Hotwire's perspective, we believe it's going to be a year of two halves. The first half of the year up to Christmas is going to be very different to the second half of the year. So I think trying to project out a year in advance is dangerous. I think as we've just talked about then, and the rest of the panel have talked about too, things are changing so quickly that I think it's about having that agility. I think we use the word agility, so I think you've got to be able to adapt quickly. But I think, by the time you get through a good plan, it can't be just a month. But I think thinking about chunks, quarters is important, but not saying, well, for the next 3 years we're going to be here. Yeah. I think it's going to be a case of map it out and course correct as you go, quarter by quarter.
Brilliant, thank you. And Annabel, same to you.
Yeah, I would have two strategies. I'd have a zoom in and a zoom out. So zoom in is almost day by day with government announcements, businesses rising or falling. So really responding and being totally on the news agenda, the government support that's there, your people, the stresses they're going through. So zoom in is absolutely the micro detail, and boards I would recommend should be speaking, if not twice a week, then at least once a week as a full leadership team, and cascading it out through to management. And then the zoom out is, well, there is going to be a new world, and I think being creative, innovative. I like Kate's idea of reading books, sitting back, taking time to reflect and look at the positives. This is an opportunity for a fundamental change in the way that we work. And it's also a very exciting time. I think there is some positivity there. It's an opportunity to have a really positive impact on how we live as families, the organisations we run, and the communities we live in, and ultimately the planet. So zooming out, I'm glass half full, and I think we could focus on some of the real positives that come out of this. So day by day, and 30 years hence.
nice. The complete difference between those two. But yeah, that sounds an excellent way to look at it. And Kate.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got much to add. I mean, I absolutely agree with what others have said. I think you certainly need to kind of have at least two different views of this. The last organisation that I was in, we'd just come out of doing a plan that lasted to 2031.
Wow.
So I think that kind of having some sense of that long range, big picture, what do you want the world to look like? Think big and imagine that kind of scenario and how you fit within it. I think the shorter term planning is probably dependent a lot on the type of organisation you are and what your kind of financial challenges are, and whether that's kind of going day to day or week to week or monthly, quarterly. Probably sort of just depends on kind of the size of the business that you're in. I think being able to kind of have that other view that you can check against and check some of the decisions that you're making against and just connect up that destination with the moves that you're making day to day.
Brilliant, wonderful. Thank you to all three of you for a great deal of insight in a short space of time. Definitely a very useful, and we had a lot of people joining us today. So thank you to the three of you. And I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us. Everyone will receive a recording after the webinar. So whether you've dropped out to join another meeting or you've managed to stay with us, thank you so much. You will get a recording. We hope to see you again next time. But for now, we'll say goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.